Hello everyone, how's it going? Azrin here, owner of the Calgary Language Nerds, and welcome to another Learn Gujarati with me podcast and video. If you're just listening to this on the podcast, you're welcome to watch a video version on YouTube. Simply search Learn Gujarati with me and you will find it. Today we're going to talk about gender and plurals in Gujarati. Now, where Gujarati is different from English is that every single object has a gender. If we look at this pen in my hand, for example, for those watching the video, a pen in English has no gender. A pen is just a pen. This is not a boy. This is not a girl. This is just a pen. But in Gujarati, along with many other languages, every single object actually has a gender. So for masculine nouns, a noun is just a fancy word for a thing, basically. Person, place, or thing, specifically. Masculine nouns tend to end in o. The last letter tends to be an o. Not always, but often. For example, a door, Darvaajo, right? See how o is the last letter? kuTro, notice how o is the last letter. So frequently, masculine nouns tend to end, the last letter tends to be an o. Feminine nouns, the last letter tends to be an e. E, that has bilaadi, baari, right, tends to have an E at the end. Now we have a third gender, which is neuter, which is not masculine or feminine. Neuter tends to end, although frequently, really frequently doesn't, I find, but tends to end in U. Now, this one, it really often doesn't end in U, but sometimes it does. So for example, ghar is neuter, but definitely doesn't end in U. However, galuriu, for example, if that's a puppy, right? Galuriu ends in u, so that's an example of a neuter noun. Okay, let's erase that. Let's erase that. Now, in terms of pluralizing, when we pluralize, excuse me, when we pluralize, we have a few different rules here. So for masculine, and actually, there's a tiny mistake. Not eo. There we go. O. There we go. So for masculine nouns that end in o, the o is going to change to an a. For example, one door, ek darvaajo, but many doors, be, tron, char, panch, chh, sat, at, however many, darvaaja. Right? So if it ends in an o, the o is going to change to a double a if it's more than one. So if you have a plural, aka more than one, we switch it to a double a. Feminine nouns, we're going to add an o. So ek bilaadi, be bilaadiyo. So we're going to add, excuse me, we're going to add an o to it. More on this o in a moment. Okay. For neuter nouns, if it ends in an u, right? So if we have this u at the end, right? That u is going to switch over to an a. Right? So more than one of something that is neuter that ends in u, the u changes to an a. Now, a couple things. A lot of words in Gujarati have a gender, masculine, feminine, whatever. They have a gender, but it doesn't end in an o, an e, or an u. The letter is something else. So one example could be something like, take the word for book. Book has a couple of different words, but one of them is pustak. Pustak. One of the words for book is pustak. When we have words that don't end in an o, an e, or an u, the general rule of thumb is that we're going to add an o to pluralize it. So ek pustak, one book, lots of pustako. Okay, so generally we're going to add an o. So if we summarize this, let's create a little summary at the bottom here. So summary, masculine nouns in o, as in they end in o, the o changes to an a. Neuter nouns that end in u, are also going to change to a. Feminine nouns that end in e are going to switch to e-o. So you're just going to add an o at the end. And then a general rule for anything that doesn't end in an o, u, or e. So if it ends in something else, right? So if the ending, the last letter, let's say, the last letter if you're watching, if you're listening on the podcast, you're like, why did I get quiet? I'm just writing on the whiteboard. Give me a sec. If the last letter is something else, general rule of thumb, although there are some exceptions, we're going to add just an o. So pustak, pustako, for example, as a general rule of thumb. Now, as you guys probably know, Gujarati borrows words from English. Phone, book, laptop, so on and so forth. Many words they'll borrow from English. In English, when we make things plural, we add an S. So like one dog, two dogs, right? We add an S at the end. Dogs, right? In Gujarati, what tends to happen with borrowed words is we tend to just keep the English pluralization rule. Ek pen, be pens, and we add an S. Now, a lot of people just keep it the same. Ek pen, be pen, tron pen. They don't add, they just keep the English word as is. So if you're borrowing a word, if you're borrowing an English word, you know, there's some variance among speakers. Some people will add the S, just like we do in English. Some people just drop the S. I think I'm like 80% sure on this, but I'm not 100%, but 80% sure based on what I've heard people say. They sometimes will even add, let's use a different color. They'll just add an O to the word themselves, like ek pen be peno. I don't know if peno, I actually don't know if people say peno. I don't think so. But I do feel like in the past, I've heard people that take an English word and they add an O to make it plural. So for English words, you kind of have two options for sure. One, just keep the word as is in the plural form, right? So like pen, ik pen, be pen, right? You can add an S, just like we do in English. Let's just say those are your two primary options. There will be some exceptions to this, you know, and same with, you know, these rules around pluralization. Like there are, let's just say that it's not an exact science. Sometimes you are going to have some exceptions from time to time, and you'll just have to learn those on a one-off basis. Same with these pluralizations of English words. Like I do feel like you're going to have some exceptions, especially with regional differences. Gujarati is not a standardized, well, it's not nearly as standardized as languages such as French or Spanish or even English, where you can look up what is the correct way to say something. And that is the correct way determined by such and such authority. In Gujarati, it's much harder to find that. And so just depends on who you're talking to. Depends on the region, depends on the person. So that wraps up our video and our lesson today on gender and plurals. Whoops. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put some words in the description box of today's episode, and I would like you to practice making them plural. So you have a word, I'll give it to you in the singular. I'll tell you what gender it is. I'd like you to try making it plural. Okay, that's in the description box for today's episode. Have a great day. We'll chat later. Aujo, bye-bye.